Hello and welcome to the webinar Strategic Right-Sizing During and After the Corona Crisis. This is Ron Nussle. This is Module 3 of the Corona webinar series for how to prepare now for the post-Corona economy for CEOs, executives, and SME owners. Let's do a quick disclaimer. So to start, we're going to do a quick review of Modules 1 and 2 of Strategic Right-Sizing During and After the Corona Crisis. We began our series by discussing the post-corona reverberations that will characterize the next new normal. Corona market correction, global trade relations realignment, the global oil war, global supply chain de-risking and nationalization, which is our topic for today. Virtual work has moved to center stage, and the renewable sector has now become high risk in many people's opinion. So let's talk about some strategic right-sizing solutions to implement now. We talked about seven solutions. In webinar number 1, we talked about strategic right-sizing, a 4-step process for doing an improvement to your company projects and products to get ready for the post-corona economy. In webinar 2, we talked about items 2 through 6, running multiple scenarios, a V, a U, and an L, staying visible to your team. We talked about using Agile Scrums to make changes now, as opposed to trying to do long-term implementations of things like new buildings and new product lines. We have to do very rapid 24-hour or 1-week Agile Scrums. We talked about minimizing the fixed cost portion of your business by changing the equation of the fixed to variable cost ratio using virtual work. And we also talked about new business development opportunities that are going to come as a result of this corona crisis. Today, we're going to specifically focus on high-risk network nodes and localizing critical commodities in your supply chain. Let's start out with some lessons learned from the global corona crisis. First off, I've been a supply chain professional for most of my career, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that globalization at many, or in fact most organizations has produced a fragile supply chain networks. Best thought of as complex systems. I used to work in the aerospace industry, and I was involved in the design of gas turbine engines and even rocket propulsion. And these are complex systems that if you change one variable, the entire system goes out of whack. Well, what we found is that the global supply chain networks are also complex systems. This quote from the Brookings Institute, globalization has produced a hierarchical, imbalanced network with critical hubs that exert outsized influence. A lot of big words. Essentially, what they're saying is that these hubs in the global supply chain network have become choke points for globalization. And one example of that is the drug supply chain. All of a sudden now, many organizations and governments and hospitals are realizing they don't even know where their drugs are coming from. They don't understand, even the FDA admits they don't understand whether their drugs are coming from the Wuhan region or not. And of course, on the left-hand side, we have the famous picture of the stockouts of toilet paper. Nobody predicted this would be the first thing that would be stocked out, but yet it's just an example of the fragile supply chains that exist. Another lessons learned is that supply chain visibility is nearly non-existent we're going to talk about tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. So this is from Foreign Policy Magazine referencing a Dun & Bradstreet study that was recently done. They said 51,000 companies around the world have either one or more tier 1 suppliers in Wuhan. So if you think about your organization, your tier 1 suppliers are the companies that work with you. They also have suppliers. This is tier 2. So 51,000 companies have tier 1 suppliers in the Wuhan region. At least 5 million companies have either a tier 1 or tier 2 supplier in the Wuhan region. And finally, 938 of the Fortune 1000 companies have either a tier 1 or a tier 2 supplier in the Wuhan region. What's another lessons learned? Well, we've seen as a result of this corona crisis, a lot of rough words going back and forth between the US and China. This is going to change the nature of the global supply chain network. And so many governments and companies and organizations are now starting to talk about localizing or nationalizing critical items in their supply chain. I can tell you for this from, again, personal experience, that organization we're working with overseas right now in a country, that country is looking to change their supply chain for these critical commodities of pharma, food, energy, etc. So better mapping and visibility of your supply chains is going to be necessary. So we've got the lessons learned. Now, how do we fix it? This is called a supply chain risk management methodology that we've been using for almost 30 years now. We are going to talk about supply chain classification. Then we'll talk about supply chain risk assessment, risk mitigation strategies. We'll talk about supply chain visibility of tier 1 or tier 2. And finally, we'll talk about implementation. And if you notice, this goes around in a circle. The reason for that is because this is a consistent process that's ongoing as part of corporate risk management. Just like after the financial crisis of 2008, Sarbanes-Oxley started edicting that companies go through these risk assessments. This is a critical part of a corporate risk assessment and risk management strategy. So let's talk about each one of these individually. I'm going to pull some slides from another webinar series that we are currently in the process of on integrated sourcing. This is actually taken from Module 8. In Module 8, we talk about de-risking the supply chain. So I'm going to pull some slides from that other webinar. We started out with a background of strategic sourcing. This is from the Harvard Business Review. The term strategic sourcing was popularized through the work of some blue chip companies in the late 1980s and 90s, GE, Honeywell, IBM. We're very fortunate that two of the co-founders of my current consulting practice actually worked for two of these blue chip companies. We were executives and we're part of these breakthrough changes. But another thing that's important to understand is that was referenced again in this Harvard article, 83% of Fortune 500 finance professionals agreed that strategic sourcing solutions can make a significant difference in their company's financials. So most companies understand strategic sourcing is a financial game changer, but what about de-risking the supply chain? So basically, we've come up with a terminology called integrated sourcing, which takes the strengths of strategic sourcing and moves it to the next level. Strategic sourcing, as I said, is primarily a financial lever to improve the profitability of organization. Integrated sourcing also gets into organizational structure and culture, creating an executive governance system, and supply network optimization and risk reduction to achieve sustainable results. So again, strategic sourcing is about financial leverage. But what about integrated sourcing? Well, really, it's about supply chain integration. Supply chain integration is the real end game of supply chain management. On the left-hand side, we have the things that are going to improve the bottom line and efficiency in operations and execution. But a lot of people don't understand that integrated sourcing can also yield seamless integration of critical business processes, administrative processes, risk management, e-commerce, inventory management, asset management, and lean process integration. So how do we do risk management in an integrated fashion? That's what we're going to discuss. So first off, we need to start with the supply chain classification methodology. So this is a proven method that has been used over 30 years now of basically assessing all of the suppliers in your supply chain using this 2x2 matrix. On the x-axis, we have supply chain complexity and risk from low to high. On the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have the value of those product lines. And then we do a 2x2 matrix of strategic suppliers in the upper right-hand quadrant, which means high complexity or high risk and high value. In the lower left-hand quadrant, we have expendables, low risk and low value. And then in the alternative two quadrants, we have commodities and key purchases. So your supply chain needs to be segmented using this methodology, and the strategies for risk assessment and supply chain integration are much different depending on which quadrant the suppliers show up in. Let me show you an example. Again, we use the term real results because these are actual part of our own internal processes that we've led. At this aircraft manufacturer, I led the supply chain for 4 years as an internal executive. We use this 2x2 matrix, and at the upper right-hand quadrant, we had jet engines. In the lower right-hand quadrant, we had screws, fittings, and rivets. Aircraft use millions of screws, fittings, and rivets. So in the upper right-hand, our engine suppliers, there was only 3 of them. And at the lower quadrant, we had their strategic standard catalog items, many suppliers. So there's much different strategy that you're going to implement depending on if a supplier falls into one of those different quadrants. And again, on the alternative 2 axes, we have these other things that are kind of fitting somewhere in the middle, have different levels of strategy. So that's supply chain classification. That's the foundation of your risk assessment. Here's an example of a risk assessment. We're actually going through this process as we speak virtually with a multinational EPC company. We started out with looking at a number of different risks. We identified 10 different risks, and then we did an assessment using probability, impact, and then an overall rating. This is a familiar process that any of you have used, come from an engineering background. In the aerospace industry, we call these FMEAs. And so we categorize all the risks from red, yellow, green. So this is risk assessment. Now let's talk about risk mitigation. The most common risk mitigation strategies, unfortunately, are do nothing or armies of people with Microsoft Excel. This is a game called Whack-A-Mole, and if you've ever played this, basically whenever the little mole pops up, you hit him on the head with a hammer. During the Corona crisis, it's been impossible for you to stay on top of all the changing dynamics. Literally, by the hour, news and information is coming from suppliers, from governments, from airlines, and some countries that we work with. By the hour, new rules about the lockdowns are coming and when the lockdowns are going to be lifted. Fortunately, we're now nearing the end of the Corona crisis, but still, these strategies and tools should be implemented now before the next crisis. At the last slide, I'm going to talk about a great article by a peer of mine, Angel Mendez, where he talked about 5 different crises that have been gone through over the last 10 years, from volcanoes to earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. And so this is obviously one of the most extreme examples. Nevertheless, supply chain de-risking is going to have to become part of your normal business processes. So the best way is a multi-enterprise platform, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So we've already talked about this 2x2 matrix. The strategies are different. So let's talk about risk assessment strategies. Strategic partnership. So I'm going to use the example of the aircraft manufacturer that I was leading the supply chain at a few years ago. As I said, we only had 3 engine suppliers. So in the middle of the Wuhan crisis, I'm not going to suddenly go find a new supplier. In fact, it's a 2-year process to qualify a new engine supplier because of all the safety regulations you have to go through. On the opposite end of the axis, we have our expendables. And our expendable items have a much lower risk. There's many more suppliers available. You could, in fact, find new suppliers if these guys shut you down during a crisis. So the strategies are much different. In the upper right-hand quadrant, you're going to manage the risk. In the lower right-hand quadrant, where you have many suppliers, low dollar value, and substitutes are available, you're going to find a new supplier. So part of this is a risk mitigation strategy is called supply-based rationalization. This is a foundation of integrated sourcing that we cover in the other webinar. So your foundation of supply chain rationalization is taking all of your suppliers and putting them into 3 broad buckets. Preferred suppliers, which is a few. This pyramid represents the size of the number of suppliers. So you have a lot of suppliers at the bottom, and phase-out suppliers. You have provisional suppliers in the middle, and your preferred suppliers at the top. Your risk reduction strategies for your preferred partners, like the engine suppliers that I talked about, is to reduce risk. The provisional suppliers, it's going to be a recovery plan to either have them move up or out. Our phase-out suppliers, we're going to transition those to other suppliers. So supply-based rationalization equals risk reduction. So we started with supply risk identification. Then we did a risk assessment and rating. Then we did a risk mitigation strategy. What's next? Supply chain visibility. These are some example slides taken from an organization that I've been working with for over 20 years, Supply Dynamics. This is actual real live, not live data, but this is screenshots of live data of having supply chain visibility of a supply network. In this case, you can see they have examples of where the parts are moving. There's little arrows. Things are going all over the world. These are from actual clients of theirs, and they show their supply network and the movements of products from one region to another. Again, if you try to use this in a whack-a-mole with Excel spreadsheets, it would be literally impossible to put this information and data together. It's also going to be nearly impossible to start and have this done in the next 2 or 3 days in the middle of the crisis. So good preparation of your supply chain design is to have these tools and capabilities in place before the crisis hits. Again, that was all discussed in the excellent article by Angel Mendez and his boss, the former CEO of Cisco, John Chambers. Here's another example from Supply Dynamics software. In this case, they have a heat map. You can see Europe, America, in this particular example, in Brazil, even something in South Africa. Another example where we had a typhoon out in the Pacific, which suppliers and which nodes of the supply chain were impacted by this typhoon. And finally, another example actually showing where would disruptions be coming in the future. This is a forecasting algorithm that they put together. So these are great tools that you can go to their website and you can look this up. These are great tools to implement now in preparation for the next new normal. Even if you didn't get it ready for this crisis, there's going to be another one. Unfortunately, about every 2 or 3 years, there's major disruptions in the global supply chain from either volcanoes or tsunamis or economic collapses. So we're in a great position to implement these things and start on it. So we talked about supply chain visibility. Finally, let's talk about implementation. So let's use that same example from our integrated sourcing program. We looked at our entire supply base as either preferred partners, provisional suppliers, or phase-out suppliers. And our risk mitigation strategy is different for all three. Similarly, our risk rating is different for all three. So these are real-life examples. Again, this is from a C-level organization, from an organization that I was a C-level executive at, a Fortune 500 company. All of our suppliers, 40% of them, we had no idea what the risk rating was. There's a recent book written by Donald Rumsfeld called The Unknown Unknown. This is the unknown unknown, the hidden portions of your supply chain, these nodes that you don't have any idea what's going on. This is the worst type of risk, the unknown risk. 33% of our overall suppliers were high risk, 20% were medium, and 7% were low risk. If we looked at our provisional suppliers, the situation looks a little better. The unknown is only 9%. Still, high risk is too high, 37%, 38% medium, and 16% low. Our preferred suppliers, these are the ones we had the most highly connected relationship with. We used to have monthly or quarterly meetings with them. Our CEO and their CEO actually knew each other on a first name basis. And in those, we only had 3% where we didn't have the risk identified. We had 20% high risk, 40 medium, and 37% low. Even though these were preferred suppliers, we still had risks. We still needed a risk mitigation strategy. However, because we had an excellent connection with these suppliers and good communication, we understood how to implement this risk reduction strategy. So the example that I showed about the EPC and construction company, risk assessment, risk mitigation, mitigation rating, and finally the execution plan, which of course is hidden for confidentiality purposes. So that's it. We've talked about the entire risk mitigation plan. And if you haven't done it yet for Corona, it's probably too late to get it done before Corona ends, because fortunately it's ending very soon. Here in the United States, things are going to start opening up around May 1st. Many states have already opened and many countries are following suit. So over the next few weeks, thankfully, many people's prayers are answered and many businessmen's prayers are answered that we're going to be heading out of this crisis, but we won't be going back to normal. We'll be going to a new normal. So here's some great articles and further reading to talk about this. Angel Mendez, an associate of mine from Honeywell or Allied Signal, and also a fellow Silicon Valley Chief Supply Chain Officer, as I was. Here's this article on LinkedIn. His boss, John Chambers, wrote an excellent article in Fortune magazine. Here's a link to Supply Dynamics. They also have some good articles on their website as well. And here's a number of other articles. We'll be sending out links to these articles for those of you that attended this webinar. We'll also be sending out links to additional webinars on integrated sourcing that we'll be conducting after this webinar. So thank you very much.